In version 8 we got a new tool called Quilting Background. Now this is a wonderful tool because it's simplified creating a background for our quilts designs, our embroideries on our quilts. And it's located in the toolboxes under Edit. So here it is down here, and if it's greyed out, that could be because you haven't put your design in yet, but it should be showing as highlighted if you've got a design sitting there. Now all you do to use it is left click on the tool and nothing will happen unless you've got your design selected. Then left click on the tool and your quilting background dialog will come up. Now I inserted this design so it's grouped. So I will check at the end of the video whether if it was ungrouped it works the same, but for now the design is grouped. And I would imagine that if you had other design elements and you wanted the quilting to go around those, you would need to group them. So I might add a few elements as well. We'll see how we go. Alright, so I'll put this here. Now if we zoom into this dialog box, we can set our block size first of all. Now you can set your block size with or without your seam allowances, and you've got a proportional scaling if you just want to change one of the sides, or you can deselect that if your quilt block is not square, and then you can have a rectangular, different width to height. The design size is shown here, so then you can be sure that your design is going to fit into your quilt. So it's already calculated the design size here. Below that you've got your stitching options, and you can use this drop down menu to choose between echo stitching, scroll stitching or stipple stitching. And then there is also an echo clipped and a scroll clipped, and I'll show you the differences of those shortly. So I'll click off. Below that you've got the design margin. That's how far away from the edge of the design you want the background stitching to start. Then you've got a block margin, which if you want your stitching not to go right to the edge of the block, you can set a margin here. Don't forget to allow for your seam allowance if you've included the seam allowance up here. If not, if you haven't included the seam allowance here, then you can just set a margin in from the edge of the block. Line spacing is how far apart each individual line in the echo or the stippling will be from its adjacent line. And then you can choose your colour. Now in the drop down menu for the colour, if you have a design in here, which you will have obviously, the design colours will be at the top, so you can use a colour from the design, or if you scroll down you can use any of the Bernina colours there. Of course you can thread your machine with whichever colour you like. Then on the right you've got a choice between using the design centre or digitising your own centre. I'm going to use the design centre so that my background stitching is centred around the design to start with. Okay, now I'm also going to choose stipple for my first choice, and I'm going to leave the defaults here for the design margin, the block margin and the line spacing, but as I said you can play around with those. So once you've set all your options here, all you do is go OK, and there you go. There's your design background stipple stitching, and it's got the margin from the edge of the design as we set in the options. I haven't got my block size here, but if I had a quilt block set up in my layout, and I'll do a video on that as well, you could show your quilt block, and I didn't set my quilt block size the same as my quilt block here, so that margin's a lot bigger, but I'll explain that when I do the video on this quilt block. But that gives you an idea of how can give you an idea of how far away from the edge your background stitching is. If I zoom out, there we go. Alright, I'm going to hide that because it is a bit distracting at the moment. Now let's have a look at the other options. So I'll zoom in a little bit more and we'll undo and we'll go to the echo stitching and go OK. And again, it has echoed around. Now the echo stitching does complete circuits that join up with each other, so they're like rings that are shaped around the design until it gets to a certain point, and then it starts to square off to the shape of the block, so you get these square looking lines on the outside. Now if you don't like those, there is an option called echo clipped. So if we undo that and go quilting background, we can go echo clipped and go OK. And in this case, what happens is it just continues on echoing from the center out and just clips off when it reaches the edge of the area defined. So once you've defined your quilt block size and your margin from the edge of the quilt, and your margin from the edge of the quilt could be 0 so that it goes right to the edge of the fabric. That's entirely up to you. And so if you prefer this look, you need to use the echo clipped. Let's undo and see what the difference between echo and scroll is. So if I go quilting background again and use my drop down menu and choose scroll and go OK. This time, instead of concentric rings, it is a spiral of stitching. So it starts here and goes around, and when it gets back to the beginning, instead of joining up with the start, it goes around in a spiral the specified distance away that we specified in the stitching spacing. And of course, once it gets to the to a certain distance, it starts to echo from the edge of the shape of the quilt block, so it squares off. So again, we can do a scroll clipped as well. So let's undo that and quilting background, scroll clipped and go OK. And there we have the scroll clipped. So it looks very much like the echo stitching, but instead of the rings joining up and it having to tie off at each ring, it just continues stitching around. Now, so there'll be no tie-in, tie-offs. It'll just keep stitching until it gets to these parts where it has to stop, because that's the defined area of the quilt, and then it will stop at each end here. You may not like this starting stitch here, so you could select that then with your select tool and perhaps go to your reshape, and you could then reshape this little area here. You could tuck it under the edge of part of the design if you so desired. It's entirely up to you by dragging the nodes. Okay, select and undo. Now let's have a look at the option where we don't use the design center. So we'll undo that and we'll go quilting background, and I'll use the stipple again. And this time I'm going to digitize the center and go OK. Now you then have a frame. This is showing the outside of the frame, shows how far the stippling will go, the background stitching will go, whatever type of stitching it is, and then you've got crosshairs showing where it is centered. So if I wanted to, I could put that part of my embroidery in the bottom corner and stipple the whole rest of the block by left clicking there. And then if I had other blocks where the design was in the top left here and the bottom right there and the top right there, I could have my embroidery designs centered with all this stippling around. So you're not constricted to having the background stitching going exactly around the design. Okay, so as promised, let's have a quick look if I ungroup the design. So we'll select it and ungroup it. So now it's in individual objects. We will go click off so it's not selected and go quilting background, and it does come up even though the design is not selected. and we'll go, we'll use the design center and go OK, and it does the same thing. But what happens if we've got a couple of other design elements that aren't joined together? So we'll undo that and we'll insert another design element, and I'm just going to randomly choose one here. Open, and of course it lands straight on top, but it's grouped, so I can move that. I would fiddle around with this. I would probably move it to here and rotate it. Move the rotation point to there and rotate it so that it... Okay, and then I could probably even do a... Well, let's actually move it away in case you have one that is not connected. All right, so let's go to our... Click off and go to our quilting background and stipple using the design center and go OK. And as you can see, it's still centered around the design, but it included both objects, even though they were separate objects. And they weren't, the top one, this one here wasn't grouped, and these two weren't grouped together. So it's quite a quick and easy tool to use. I hope you have lots of fun with that.